Welcome to the Leading Voices in Food podcast. I'm Kelly Brownell, Director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. This podcast is part of a series focused on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our food system. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Caitlin Welsh. She is the Director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies based in Washington, D.C. Caitlin is a leading expert on global and U.S. food security, and particularly on the relationship between food security, urbanization, climate change, and conflict. Caitlin, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Kelly.
So let's begin by giving our listeners some context. How is the COVID-19 food security crisis different from others? Let's say the 2007-2008 food crisis that was caused by the Great Recession.
Thanks for that question. What we're experiencing right now is a crisis that's not related to production levels, whether you're talking about food insecurity in our own country or around the world. The last global food crisis that we experienced was the crisis of 2007 and 2008, and the crisis was caused by low production levels and high prices. The crisis we're experiencing right now is not a crisis that's rooted in low production levels. Instead, it's rooted in disruptions across food systems writ large. In my analysis, I've seen at least 6 different types of disruptions. The first one being reductions in wages and job losses, which has widespread effects on food insecurity. In some countries, you're seeing that lockdowns are threatening the transportation of ag inputs like seeds and fertilizer to farms. A third type of disruption I'm seeing is that lockdowns are threatening the movement of labor to farms. As one example, in Europe, there may be an estimated shortfall of about 1 million seasonal ag workers because of lockdowns related to COVID. A fourth type of disruption is that lockdowns may threaten the transportation of food from farms to markets. And in the United States, I think that we've done a very good job of preventing this from happening. Early on in the pandemic, back in March, the Department of Homeland Security included truck stops as part of our critical infrastructure, in part to make sure that food could be transported from where it's produced to where it's consumed. A fifth type of disruption I've seen is when social distancing measures result in reduced access to urban markets on which many consumers rely to meet their food needs. It's oftentimes urban consumers who are hit first by disruptions at the market level. And the sixth type of disruption are trade disruptions. And these happened earlier on in the pandemic. In some cases, you saw labor shortages and slowed operations at ports, which hindered the trade of food from producers to markets. So I'm seeing disruptions at many points in food systems and not a crisis of production as we saw the last time.
Caitlin, you spent a decade working in U.S. government positions, including 7 years in the Department of State's Office of Global Food Security. So you know an awful lot about this issue. Can you describe what you're seeing globally relative to food insecurity?
We don't yet have a global assessment that's given us a very clear picture of food insecurity, but we have estimates that are done by a few different organizations. The World Food Program has estimated that the number of people who could experience acute food insecurity this year could reach 270 million. They think that COVID will push an extra 120 million people into acute food insecurity. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization provides its own estimate. The numbers are different but complementary. The FAO looking at best, mid, and worst case scenarios. Even in the best case scenario, COVID-19 could increase the number of food insecure people around the world by 83 million people.
Those are startling numbers. Should the approach global leaders take to improve global food security change in response to COVID-19? And if so, how would you suggest things be done?
That's a great question. And I think that because of COVID-19, we should be taking a different approach than the approach that we took in response to the last crisis. But I also think that even if this pandemic had not happened, we should be shifting our approach anyway, based on new data that we're seeing. So I'll address both things. Because COVID-19 is causing disruptions across food systems writ large, I think that the global food security community should renew its focus on food systems post-production, and on the importance of transportation mechanisms to get inputs and labor to farms, on transportation to get food from farms to markets, on the importance of markets, particularly in urban areas, on global trade. So I think that COVID-19 is underscoring for us the importance of all of these elements to global food security, all these elements that happen post-production. I do think, though, again, that even if this pandemic hadn't happened, data that we're seeing now is showing us that the approach that we were taking in response to the last crisis, again, that was a crisis that had to do with production levels, isn't necessarily improving global food security. So in response to that last crisis, the global food security community coalesced around an approach that generally focused on increasing agricultural productivity of staple crops in developing countries. And for many years, we were following that approach that had some positive benefits among some populations in some countries around the world. But just last month, the UN put out its annual report on the status of hunger and malnutrition around the world. And this is the annual report that measures progress against the Sustainable Development Goal on hunger. That is SDG 2, with targets to end hunger and targets to end all forms of malnutrition by 2030. And the findings of this report were shocking to me. One of the main findings was that combining numbers, people experiencing moderate food insecurity and severe food insecurity, you have an estimated quarter of the world's population. On top of that, something that's very interesting that was it calculated the average price of healthy diets around the world, a good healthy diet and the best healthy diet. And for both of those diets, the average cost around the world is greater than the international poverty line. So essentially, if you're living in poverty, you can't even afford the minimally healthy diet around the world. And people are saying, as a result of that, should we be thinking of the international poverty line differently if it can't even buy you the cheapest healthy meal?
Caitlin, I saw the same numbers that you did and was startled by them just as you are. And it makes me wonder, and I'd be curious to see what you think, is there any hope at all of meeting that 2030 Sustainable Development Goal 2 of having no hunger around the world? I mean, that would have been a tall order, even if things had been getting steadily better, but they're getting steadily worse.
Yeah, again, the targets are to end hunger and end all forms of malnutrition. And as of this year's report, the UN is saying that hunger continues to increase and that when it comes to malnutrition, the current level of effort is not anywhere near enough to end malnutrition in the next decade. I also see less attention to this issue politically. It's not high on U.S. development agenda. I don't see it as high on UN agenda around the world. We'll see what the G7 and G20 do about it. I'd like to put some color around the approach that we devised in response to the last crisis, which was to increase the production of staple crops. In 2015, the entire intelligence community put together an assessment on global food security. And their bottom line judgment was that simply growing more food globally will not lead to more food secure countries. And I think that that's what we're seeing around the world. It's very important to be investing in agricultural production of staple crops, but simply growing more food is not going to lead to more food security. And that's what we're seeing today.
So let's turn our focus to the U.S. How has COVID-19 affected food systems in America?
Happy to talk about that. When it comes to the United States, again, I think it's analogous to what we're seeing around the world, where we have relatively high and stable production of many different types of food around our country. And at the same time, you're seeing spikes in food insecurity by many different measures. You can look at the number of people who are utilizing food banks. You can look at the level of food insecurity among children. All these numbers are spiking. So I'll describe the disruptions that I've observed across U.S. food systems. When it comes to food banks, we're seeing that in the pandemic, demand at U.S. food banks has increased by an average of 70% compared to this time last year. So a big spike across the board. About 40% of customers at food banks had never gone to food banks before the pandemic hit. Grocery store prices are increasing. So you've had small upticks in prices in cereals and fruits and vegetables, but the biggest increase is in the price of beef. The beef index increased 20% in the 3 months of April, May, and June. And that's the largest increase in history.
Given what you've just said about food banks in particular, how would you characterize the state of food security overall in the United States?
Yeah, the last nationwide assessment of food insecurity in the United States was in 2018. They haven't produced an assessment yet of this year that captures the effects of the pandemic. But we do have surveys that are done weekly by the U.S. Census Bureau, and their data is showing that we have historic levels of food insecurity among households with children, but they've updated the survey such that data is now showing that it's children specifically, highest levels on record in the United States. It's 14 million children around the country experiencing food insecurity.
I'd like to ask you about COVID, food security, and racial justice. Well, what is the relationship that you see among these, and what are your thoughts about how to best move forward?
Yeah, that's an incredibly important question right now. I just mentioned that there were historic rates of food insecurity among children, but the rate is far higher among Black and Hispanic households than white households. About 3 in 10 Black households with children are experiencing food insecurity. So it's about 30% of Black households, about 25% of Hispanic households with children, compared to a rate of only 10% for white households. And my experience in this community is that I think that before the pandemic and before the racial reckoning that we're experiencing right now, people used to take for granted that you would experience higher rates of poverty and food insecurity among communities of color in the United States. And I'm seeing a really important and much needed shift where we're not accepting that as given. And instead, people are saying, why is this happening? And what can we do about it? I look forward to those conversations and I look forward to those solutions. There's no silver bullet to these things. I'd like to switch to something related to this, which is the relationship of the pandemic to food insecurity and to race in the United States. So I think that we've all heard that Black and Latino Americans have died of COVID-19 at 2 to 3 times the rate of white Americans. And I think that it's important to note that among the factors that lead to morbidity and mortality rates from COVID, the second most important factor to age is obesity. And nationwide, the rate of obesity is higher among Black and Hispanic adults than it is among white adults. So I think that obesity, which is a manifestation of malnutrition, plays an important role in the impact of COVID-19 on people of color in the United States. I think it's important to look at the interplay of race, COVID-19, and food insecurity in the United States. And then to get to your question about what to do about food insecurity among people of color, I think that there are a number of things for us to look at. It's not only about food access. The conversation often goes directly to lack of full service markets in communities of color. I think that it should go beyond that. It's strongly linked to income, so increasing wages, importance of investments in infrastructure like public transportation. And I think there are other conversations that we need to be having as well. So right now, headlines are being made around the increase in evictions because of the lapse of federal benefits at the end of July. There's strong links between eviction rates and food insecurity. I've been reading studies about correlation between food insecurity at age 5 and eviction rates for children. So there's connections between being evicted and having high rates of food insecurity. So communities of color are hit hardest, and I think that the policy community needs to coalesce.
Your work is incredibly important, and these issues are so pressing that it's nice that such talented people are working on them, but I realize there's a lot to do. So thanks for sharing all this information with our audience.
Thank you. You're very welcome, Kelly. Thanks for having me today.
And thank you to our listeners for being with us. If you'd like to subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or your favorite podcast app. Podcasts and transcripts of the podcast are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center. This is Kelly Brownell.